All right, we're on to chapter 4. Hopefully, you've gone and found the next outline that starts up. Our next outline covers chapter 4, 5, and 6, starting with this one, of course. And chapter 4 gets into the role of profits in an economy and just how important they are. And then, of course, we talk a little bit about different financial statuses, like what chapter 4 actually starts with. So, in review, the role of the entrepreneur is an opportunist or a visionary organizer who brings together capitalists, landlords, workers, and specialized knowledge to create goods and services that consumers want. And that is the key right there. They will bring together the other factors of production to create something that the consumers actually want. Because if you go out and you create something that the consumers don't want, you're going to lose everything that you risk all the time, everything you put into it. Because the whole point is to fulfill a want or need in the marketplace that consumers have. So there's three possible financial statuses that you can end up with. Of course, the overall goal is the company makes a profit. If your company is making a profit, you are fulfilling what the consumers want or need, and then along with that, you're doing it effectively and efficiently to some extent. Now, companies can make profits usually in the short run if they're not running all that well, as long as they're fulfilling exactly what consumers want and need. But over time, those lack of efficiencies and lack of effectiveness can actually lead to losses in a company. I'm sure all of us can start going over some examples of some poorly done processes in companies that we have worked for. So another status that you can run into as a company is break even, where nothing is lost or gained. If you've studied small business before, a lot of times that break even point can take some years to get to. 5 years actually isn't that completely uncommon for those companies that have large capital expenditures to start up. There can be even some longer break even points for some really heavy capital intensive industries. So, say you were a company, you were starting out a new airplane manufacturing company, for instance, the capital equipment and the land and the size of the factory that you would need to do such an endeavor would be quite expensive and would take a long time to turn around and get back. Of course, when you're an investor, the break even point for a new company is really important to you because once they get past the break even point, that's when you can start looking at, well, when am I going to get my return on investment? Now, if we're talking about a company that's already been in existence, so they've already started up years and years and years ago and they hit their initial break even, and they're hitting break even now again. So profits have dwindled down to the point where they're just hitting break even. Now this would be a red flag for a lot, but of course there's other things that you have to bring into consideration. What is the economic condition, for instance? So, if we just ran into this massive recession and company losses are across the board, and your particular company gets a break even, that could actually be a really good thing because you're actually not losing something versus uh, versus actually losing something. So, you're doing better in the current conditions. But in today's economy, of course, there's a lot of pressure to get even higher profits than normal because of the way the interest rates are at. So your opportunity costs. So if you end up with higher interest rates on treasury bonds, for instance, so the 10-year treasury bond's been floating around 3%. That means that your company is going to have to put out well over 3% in return on investment for your investors because why would they invest in you if they could just get a 3% treasury bond if you're not making well over that 3%? because you are going to be a high risk while the treasury bond is going to be very, very low risk. So break even for a company right now that isn't showing a ton of promise, people are going to start dumping that and getting into something that's going to have a much better return on investment than that. Then, of course, the third condition is you're losing money. And a company can operate under this condition for a period of time and not forever. A good example of a company that's been operating under this for a long, long time now is Sears. Sears has been eating its own capital for a long time to stay alive. They haven't actually turned a real profit. So, what I mean by real profit in this case is that they haven't made a profit by actually just selling their normal goods and services in years. There was a few times where they actually did turn a profit, but when you go and you look at the financial statements, you find out they made that profit because they sold some of their assets from the companies. So they sold a bunch of their buildings, they sold some of their brands, something along those lines that actually pushed them up into the profit area. If they hadn't sold part of their assets away like that, they would have never turned a profit. So that was a temporary fix to their situation. And Sears has been doing that for years, ever since Kmart actually came in and caused the merger with Sears, and that CEO took over. It's just been a slowly cannibalization of their assets to kind of prolong their well-being. They never really went in to try to fix the issues in either Kmart or Sears. They just kind of kept pedaling along, and that's the situation they're in now. If you'd been following them recently, they sold Craftsman off to Black & Decker and Stanley, and they're trying to sell Kenmore at this point. They've taken emergency loans from their own CEO. So things aren't looking too good for them, but they haven't looked good for them for years. So profits and losses determine what is produced, when it is produced, and how much is produced, and then how it is produced in the economy. The more profitable a particular good or service is, the more advantageous it is to get into that. So that particular market is going to attract more entrepreneurs to it, which will cause more of it to be produced. And the more entrepreneurs that you attract to something, the more competitive that market's going to get. And in theory, things will start getting more effective and more efficient. It's going to put huge downward pressures on price, which is great for us as consumers. And eventually, the profit margins in that particular industry is going to be squeezed, and the attractiveness of it is going to lower by quite a bit. You might even get to the point where some of the entrepreneurs that just weren't as good at producing that good or service are going to exit that particular industry, and the big leaders that have figured it out and really made what we want are going to be the ones that come out on top. Profits are essential to long-term survival for a company. It's kind of a no-brainer. If you aren't making profit, you're not getting your return on investment. You have a heavy opportunity cost on that. So maybe you're plugging along here for a number of years, you hit your break even, and then you continue to hit break even over and over again. There's other things you could be doing with your time. There's other things you could be doing with your money, those assets. So even if you were hitting break even for a number of years, there's a good chance that you're going to look at selling that company or getting out of that situation so that you start getting some sort of return on all that investment that you're putting into that particular company. Now, in the long run, companies that fail to add value in the competitive market will not survive. So if you don't turn a profit and you hit losses and you can't bring more money into the company to cover those losses, eventually your company is going to have to close. You can't live forever not turning a profit. And the only company that I've seen actually live a significantly long period of time without making a profit has been Sears. But Sears had so many assets to to get rid of. They own so much property. They owned a skyscraper. They used to call it Sears Tower. It's now known as Willis Towers. They sold that a while back too. So losses are a temporary state of affair. And if you can't get out of that situation, it's going to cause you to close. Now, if you go to page 78, figure 4.4, it's a really simple model right here. And all it's showing is that you have your expenses and then you have your revenues. And if your revenues are larger than your expenses, you are making an accounting profit. Now, there is actually a difference between an accounting profit and a economic profit. When we talk about accounting profit, we are looking at that revenues minus expenses. But when you look at economic profit is a situation where you are making more than your opportunity cost as well. And then, if you remember when we talked about depreciation, accounting profit accounts for depreciation while we take all the expense in one chunk in economic profit. So if you built a very large building this year, odds are you didn't make an economic profit because that's going to be a huge expense that just gets expensed off that year right then and there. Now, when I'm talking about opportunity costs, so if treasury bonds for 10 years are at 3%, 3% is your opportunity cost. So if you make, say, a 2% profit in your business, you made a 2% accounting profit. In economics, you had a 1% economic loss because you could have made more money if you had that in the treasury bond. And we will return to the accounting profit versus economic profit again when we start getting into cost curves and whatnot, and that's going to be near the end of the semester. Now, we also have model 4.6, which the model is actually showing Sears in 1992, where they had a loss of $1.2 billion. So, yeah, Sears is a great example of what not to do, right? So, the opportunity cost of capital is other uses for the capital. Investors must see a larger return on their investment than they could get if they had gone for a safer means of that investment. The investor is seeking to do more than just meet inflation. So the first point we already hit about, where you've got to beat out that treasury bond, you got to beat out those safer forms of investment and give a good return for the level of risk you have. But you also have this other factor of inflation in there. If you're only turning a 3% return and the inflation rate's 3%, you're returning nothing to your investors. The investors are going to consider that. And the higher the inflation rate gets, of course, the higher the pressure there is on profits. Returning to that little point I made that we have this higher pressure for companies to make profits right now in our economy, it also is partly because of the increasing inflation rate. So the inflation rate here in the United States is expected to go up, and it's going to continue to go up for a bit here. And we've got some pressures that are forcing that inflation rate up. Of course, in macroeconomics, you learn that your inflation rate is heavily influenced by what our Federal Reserve Bank is doing. Our Federal Reserve Bank is still printing quite a bit and adding to the money supply. And when you add to the money supply, the price of our money goes down. So the inflation rate in that case is going up. But we also have some other factors out there that are helping push the inflation rate. And part of that is the new tariffs that have come about. And it's not from what you're probably thinking immediately. You're probably going, well, the tariffs are raising the prices because that tax is getting figured in, and we, the consumer, end up paying the tariffs we put up. And that's true, but that's not actually what's going to add to the money supply. So when we talk about inflation, we're talking about the classical definition, which is adding to the money supply. So what would cause money to be added to the supply? And tariffs actually do that by this. So if you were living in another country, so let's say you live in Japan, and you see the United States putting up all of these different trade barriers. And it could be tariffs, it can be quotas, it can be outright bans of products from specific countries or companies. And we've actually seen outright bans from companies. We banned a few Chinese cell phone manufacturers, for instance, from entering our market for, in quotations, reasons. Anyway, when you have these tariffs, you're getting rid of uses for the US dollar. So if you're in Japan and you see these tariffs and you see these barriers coming up, the uses you have for your dollars that you have in hand just decreased. And if you think that a trade war is coming and these barriers are going to get worse, you're going to dump those dollars. So originally you were holding those dollars for whatever reason. Now you're going to get rid of them and get into some other currency. So a whole bunch of individuals throughout the world have been dumping the dollar. So that's been adding to the inflation rate. Now, another area that, of course, is more obvious that adds to the inflation rate is we just recently had those large tax cuts that went through at the end of this last year. And there's benefits and there's downsides to it. And of course, the benefits is you're putting more money into the hands of Americans and American companies, and I'm sure you've already heard about raises and all these things that individuals have got. That's the plus side. The downside, of course, is inflation. And the reason why inflation is caused by the tax cut is because we did not cut expenses. If you cut taxes and you don't cut expenses, we have to get that money from somewhere, so the Federal Reserve just ends up having to print it. And then we get hit with the invisible tax of inflation, which is far worse. So is break even or near break even a good long term situation? In most cases, it's not that great of a situation to be in the long term. Short term, yes. I mean, obviously, when we talk about a new company that's originally hitting break even, that's wonderful. Or we talk about downturns in the economy, that's a good thing as well. However, when you break even, you don't have anything to return to yourself, your own company, to sit there and invest. So to allow yourself to grow as a company, you don't have any of that capital, increased capital that it is to work with. You just have the same that you had before. And then on top of that, you're not making a profit to pay for your investment in there. Maybe you're a small business owner and if you continue to take a break even, you can't take a paycheck. If you take that paycheck, you're eating capital. And when we say eating capital, that's where you're going away and taking money out of your company that you need to just run your company. The money that you need to rebuy your inventory, for instance, and upkeep your building, those kind of things. So if you eat capital, you're eating that money. And then, of course, there is no return on investment for your investors. So if you're a corporation, you continue to hit that break-even point, or you're a small business and you have investors that you've promised money back on over a certain period of time, and you're just hitting break-even over and over and over again. Eventually, those investors are going to call back for that money because, well, they're not getting anything for that money they put away, and it's just getting eaten away by inflation as it sits there and doesn't make them any money back. So the minimum acceptable long-run condition for a company in the economy is to earn a return, and a larger return than its competitors, hopefully. So capitalist entrepreneurs are not interested in risking their money on ventures that cannot promise a better return that they can go and get elsewhere. So that's the key. So we talked about the 3% treasury bond, but you're also in competition with other companies within your market. You're in competition with companies in other markets as well. especially if they have similar risk levels to you, because those investors can just pull that money out and then go over to the other companies that are giving the much larger return on investment. So when you're starting that company and you have those investors, you have to make sure that you're getting that return for your investors and you continue to get those good levels, or those investors are going to pull out, or you're not going to be able to find new investors, even if the ones are nice enough to stay with you and give you a chance because they believe in you. Real growth can only take place when a company earns profits. If you're not earning profits, there's no way for you to return that money back to the company and get that investment and really grow yourself. So those profits aren't only important for getting a return back to your investors, but it's also what's going to be one of the driving forces between the growth rate of your company. Value is not only excuse me. Value is added not only to the company but to the economy as well. So if you are earning that profit, there's lots of individuals that are voting with their dollars for your company. They're coming in saying, you're the one that is doing it the best, in our opinion. You make the best product for the money, so we're going to buy from you. And that also means that you are creating exactly what the consumers want. Therefore, we're creating value. We go back to those original chapters. I mean, we are fulfilling a need or want in the economy. And as you continue to make that profit, if you're making a profit without government help, and that's the key, you can't have government help in there because that ends up muddling the whole situation. Anyway, you make that profit without the help, you are adding to the economy as well, because odds are you are bringing the price of that product down and raising the quality of that product if you're the one that are turning the big profit. Value is added at the micro level. The company will grow. The company is going to add more employees, or they're going to give their employees raises. They're going to offer better products and services, etc. And then, of course, at the macro level as well, because we're adding to our gross domestic product through production. If we are successfully lowering prices, we're increasing the standard of living for the country, and so on. A high return on capital allows a company to expand by buying new equipment, train new employees, buy new technologies, etc. So economic value added is a statistic created to quantify the opportunity cost of capital. Sometimes it's actually known as super profits and as residual income. You're not going to be tested on how to calculate this number whatsoever. All you need to know is that is what it is. So it's a way we can actually look at what's being added value-wise to the economy. After-tax operating profits are considered into it, so your normal accounting profits, and then appropriate capital charge for both debt and equity of the company will give us our economic value added. And there's actually a couple of different ways you can calculate this, and if you're interested in actually looking at the calculations itself, go ahead and give it a Google and you'll find it pretty quickly. So in the sense of the market, what does profits mean? Profit is the best single measure of a company's contribution to society and the source of corporate strength. So if we go and look at an economy and we're looking at it and we adjust it for inflation, so we take that inflation rate, because obviously inflation is a decrease of value of the money, so we don't want to get that, because otherwise we'll see a fake level of profit in the economy. So if you have a 3% inflation rate and the economy's 3% profit rate, we're only breaking even technically, because you got to take that inflation rate right out. So if the economy is showing strong profits after we take inflation out, that is a healthy economy. That economy is growing and is showing a lot of potential. If there's lots of companies profiting in that economy and we don't have companies taking most of those from government and things like that, that is a great measure of the future of the standard of living in that country as well, because that means that the expenditures and prices are being pushed downwards. Higher than expected profits signal consumers like the products and want more of it. So we gave that example of that one industry that was attracting all the different entrepreneurs because there was a high profit level. So that's how it can generally start, and then eventually it ends up lowering as more and more entrepreneurs get into it, and they end up putting such a heavy pressure on costs and whatnot. When we talk about monopolies and stuff, actually only a couple of weeks away now, um, we'll get into that, and you'll see that as an example. Losses indicate the customers are not satisfied with the company. So if you're losing money, odds are you're not doing it very effectively and efficiently. So there's a lot of things in your company that you can do a lot better to offer that product and service better. And odds are that you are probably not the best product or service in that particular market as well. Because, well, the consumers are voting with their dollars with other companies, not your companies. Economic profits and losses are a guide to an individual's company's decisions to increase or decrease output according to desires of the consumer. So when you're making lots of profit, you're being told you're doing it right. It's keep doing it. Get more of it for us. If you get more of it for us, you're going to end up getting more profits. So you get that huge incentive. While if you end up pulling heavy losses, you may just look at pulling out of the economy because you're not doing it correctly. You've got to make changes. So you've either got to pull your company out and close down and go invest in something else before you lose even more, or find a way to do it a heck of a lot better and fast. The health and wealth of a large number of individual businesses can determine the economic health and wealth of a nation. So when you add up tons and tons and tons of these small companies, they are what ends up adding up and determining whether we have a healthy economy and whether we are growing more wealthy as a nation. So, if a lot of our small businesses, as well as some of our larger companies, are all doing really, really well, odds are the economy is going to be chugging along and doing really, really well as well. So there's 5 ways to account for company profits. And what the book means when we're saying account for these profits, these are ways to increase your profits from your current position. So one way you could do it is cut costs. Obviously, if you lower the expenses, when we were looking at those figures before with the expense bar versus the revenue bars, you're going to lower that expense bar so you don't have to make as much revenues to make a profit. Our second option is we can increase prices because then we will get more revenue in per product we sell. But there is a huge thing to consider with this one. If you remember back when we were talking about the law of demand, the law of demand says that if you increase your price, the quantity sold or demanded is going to go down. So you may get more revenue per item, but are you going to increase revenues overall versus what you're going to lose because you're not selling as many items? So, or increasing your prices comes with risk. You can raise your output of production, and if this one's making you scratch your head a little bit, considering that would increase your expenses because, well, you produce more units, your variable costs go up, right? What this is referring to is economies of scale. So the more you produce, the more you can spread out your fixed costs. So those fixed costs are those costs that don't go away. So if you produce nothing as a company, those fixed costs are still there. The variable costs are those costs that go up as you produce more. Now, there's a certain point where economies of scale, of course, stop and they become diseconomies of scale. But initially, the price per unit of production ends up going down as you raise output, and until you finally hit that point where variable costs are going up so much that it ends up leading to diseconomies of scale, so you end up costing you more to produce. Excuse me. And economies of scale, you're gonna get hit over the head with here when we start getting into monopolies, because if monopolies, many of them in the past got to the point where they were by leveraging economies of scale, getting to that point where very large production levels ends up giving them very low per unit costs. So another way you could do it is expand the product line. So if you add different products to your line, odds are you're going to end up selling more. You're going to be able to meet different consumers' needs. So if you do it correctly, you can end up leading to profits. But this is another one of those that can actually lead to losses as well. And then, of course, selling off non-performing assets. This is kind of the Sears way of doing things. So you start selling off assets that aren't doing that well for you. But of course, when we say Sears, they've also sold things that were doing well for them too, because they had to just to stay alive. So Sears actually isn't a great example. So when you have non-performing assets in your company, it's best to get rid of them because they are actually just a drain. They're just a huge expense for you because they're not turning a profit. They're not adding to the profit level of your company. Now, companies have a variety of ways to account for these sources of profitability, and they don't have to just stick to one category, of course. So, uh, odds are, if you're a company, you're looking at all sorts of different ways within there. And if you're a larger company, so you're a corporation, you're probably doing all five quite a bit each year. You're getting rid of those non-performing assets. You're adding to your product lines. You're trying to find ways to expand production to lower that per unit cost, etc., etc. Now, companies rely on four statements as kind of a guide to kind of tell how they are actually doing in their situation. So we have income statements, balance sheets, the cash flow statement, and then we even have a economic statement that we can look at. So looking at the whether you're making an economic profit, but that one's actually not that common. Obviously, the ones you've heard about from here is the income statement and the balance sheet, because those are by far the most common. But your larger companies are darn well doing a cash flow statement as well. So they use these as kind of a measure to see how they are doing. Unfortunately, they do not paint a perfect picture, because if there's some things inherently wrong in the company with your production line, how you're doing things, maybe you're not repairing things as much as you need to, and machinery is going to be breaking down a lot in the coming years, and you don't know that. So there's a lot of unknowns that these statements aren't going to give, but they are a good snapshot of the past for that company, and that is one of the keys to remember. This is all data that's been collected, and then you're looking at a picture of either that given point in time based on the data that led up to that, or something in the past. So value added, of course, is another way we could look at how a company is doing. So each part of the process adds value to the economy, but it's obviously not as popular, and we don't have a very concrete way to measure that as well as like what we do with the income statements, balance sheets, cash flow, and economic profit. So it's not very popular. Kind of like the value added approach for gross domestic product. You can go at that road too, but it's not very popular. Very rarely done anymore. Are profits always a reliable guide on whether a company is doing well? The answer is actually no. Just because you're doing really well a year for profit doesn't necessarily mean you're a really healthy company. Businesses can be very short-sighted and focusing on now and sacrificing the later, for instance. Or maybe they're not returning any kind of investment back to the company to make sure things continue to grow. They just kind of let things go, pull the money out as profits, and be happy. And of course, that's sacrificing the later. Another thing they could be doing is taking part in dishonest business practices. And dishonest business practices will actually only work usually in the short run because eventually it's going to get out what you're doing, even if it's a legal practice. Obviously, if it's illegal and it comes around, you're going to be looking at large fines, and then it's going to get out, and people are going to know what you did, etc. But if you're a dishonest business and you're not giving customers what you promise, that's going to get out. That's going to show up in your reviews online, and the word of mouth is going to spread that you're doing what you're doing, and that's going to really hit your bottom line. And if you decide to become a more honest business person and start doing things better, it's going to take a long time to get rid of that negative stigma that's going to follow your company. And you may never get rid of it. You might end up stuck with it for life. And then, of course, people make mistakes, and companies are run by people. So a company could be making profits over and over and over, year after year after year after year, and then leadership in that final year there ends up making some major missteps, and well, it runs the company into the ground. When we talk about Standard Oil, we're actually going to be looking at this as well because it was actually some major mistakes that ends up leading to the downfall of market share for Standard Oil. Honesty is by far the best policy for long-term survival and profitability. If you're dishonest with either your employees or you're dishonest with your regulatory bodies, you're dishonest with your customers, it's going to come back and bite you full force. It's going to cost you at some point. It is impossible to hide everything forever, and eventually it is going to come and hurt. So if you are honest the whole way through, don't ever have to worry about that bite back, do you? So your primary focus as a company should always be literally to fulfill the needs of the customers and do it as best that you can, the best efficiently, the most effectively that you can. And if you do so, you are going to be successful and the profits will result. So what can a company do to expand profits? How you can take on new ventures, you can expand your current lines, you can concentrate on the input side, so cut costs, you can downsize the company, so get rid of extra workers that you don't need, get rid of the high price suppliers, questionable departments, so on. Sell off the unprofitable divisions, reorganize and become less bureaucratic. This one's huge, especially nowadays. Reorganization can save your company a lot of money because we end up with a lot of departments that aren't actually adding value to the company. And of course, if you want to see the worst of the worst when it comes to bureaucratic, just look at the way government does things. And of course, another thing we can do is move to lower rent districts. So lots of different ways we can do to expand profits. Many times the best direction is to work on both the input and output sides of the business to expand the profits, not to just look at one side. So what are the many different ways we can do to make things more effectively and efficiently and give customers exactly what they want? So cost-benefit analysis is literally just comparing a change in revenues with a change in costs in the business as your way of determining whether or not you should make that decision. Cost-benefit analysis is used by government to decide whether a new dam or a new highway will be beneficial, for instance. And it's a very utilitarian approach to deciding whether or not to do it. And utilitarianism says that if the greater good benefits from this overall, so if it looks like there's going to be more profit than there is cost in this situation, then it is what we should do. So if we build this road and we take out a bunch of people's homes and more people benefit than lose, the government thinks this is a win. So cost-benefit analysis can't be your only analysis when you start deciding on what to do. When you're talking about, in the case of governments, of course, how do you measure the loss that those individuals are facing when they lose their homes and they don't want to move, for instance, because that family home's been in their family for 150 years. You can't replace that. So you can't really measure that all that well. So the best way of doing that would have been to leave that to the market instead of just forcing the situation. If you force the situation like the government does, odds are we're not actually benefiting nearly as much as we could have. Or maybe that road that they want to put through may never outweigh the losses we get just from those individuals because of the amount of heavy loss that they take from that, for instance. So companies can use cost-benefit analysis to decide whether to do a new venture or to reorganize. Um, and that is a big part of the picture on whether to do it. So is this going to return a profit for you? But you're also going to want to look at other factors as well. Are you going to really be fulfilling a need? Is this going to add value for your consumer and whatnot later on? So don't just get caught up on cost-benefit analysis when deciding on whether to do something. Entrepreneurships and the quest for profits leads to more quantity, quality, and variety. This is huge. This is the competitive process right here in a nutshell. So the entrepreneurs are all out there trying to find ways to get more profit, and they're going to do that by increasing the quantity, so leveraging economies of scale. They're going to find ways to increase the quality to attract you to them versus them. Your competitors are going to come up with variety, all the different colors and options and all these different things to engage you as a customer and get you exactly what you want. And all these things end up leading to an increase of standard of living for us. In the past 20 years, there's been a heavy tendency towards a wider variety of products. And because entrepreneurs are profit seeking individuals, they know by better satisfying their customers, profits expand. And that is the key for why that is happening. So, especially with the advent of the online market that we've got now, more of us are looking heavier for exactly what we want instead of just going to the store and getting something that closely represents what we really, really would want. So you're going to go out and look around and go, well, I really want this and this specific color or this size and then this price, and you're going to be willing to look a little bit more to find that. And companies know that now, so they are providing a much wider variety to make sure they hit all of those different needs. The expense side of the input-output model demonstrates the tendency towards efficiency and waste avoidance. So there's a huge incentive for companies to avoid waste and try to do things as efficiently as they can because they will get larger profits for it. When we were talking in the earlier chapters, when I talked about coals, about using less electricity and recycling cardboard, and then I don't know if I got into the fact that they've been putting solar panels on the roof of stores that are in high sun areas. Those are all areas that are adding to efficiency and lowering cost and taking waste and turning it into profits. So there's a huge incentive for businesses to find uses for byproducts, find ways to lower pollution in many different ways, and increase those profits because of it. And then, of course, there's in the United States, because we've hit the point where we care more about the environment, companies that pollute more can actually end up with a negative stigma, while those that are being more green, like in the case where Kohl's was just advertising as being green for recycling and using green energy, etc., can get them more sales because people like to see that and they want the cleaner air. Now, we'll talk more about the wealth effect in later chapters, but it is a really interesting thing to consider how much the wealth of a nation will affect the pollution levels. If you lower the amount of wealth in a nation, for instance, you're more likely to have a lot more pollution in there because people can't afford to worry about pollution yet. So, government organizations often do not face the discipline of the market since they do not operate on a profit loss basis and thus often become bloated, inefficient, and unresponsive to customer needs. I just went on what my wife actually got to call a Zelda quest, and this is the quest of document in authentication. So, in order for me to go over to China to work, I had to prove that I had my master's degrees. I had to prove that I worked for various universities, etc., etc. So, I had to take my degrees. I had to pay to get new copies from the university and have them notarized. And then when those showed up, I had to drive them out to Lansing to get what was called the Great Seal. It's just a big sheet of paper that just basically says, yes, this is an authentic document. So, and then after you get that stapled, I have to drive down to Chicago. And then in Chicago, I go to the Chinese consulate and submit those to be authenticated by the Chinese government. And then that ends up saying, yes, he actually has this degree. So Jiangnan University, the one that I teach for over there, then can say, well, he has credentials to meet their rules for having teachers come there. And it also allows them to prove that they can hire me so I can get my visa to go over there. But that whole process is kind of funny. So we had to pay for all the notarizations and we had to pay for this great seal, but nowhere in there was there any check to actually see if that document was real. And I'll give you an example. So for my wife to be able to teach over at Jiangnan, she had to get a certification. And she took this certification online. And when I initially went and read up on it, I saw that you had to get this whole notarization thing and Great Seal thing done in order for the Chinese consulate to certify it. So I was like, okay. So I found out where the degree was going to be printed, and it was going to be printed in Thailand, which to me told me, well, I've got to get it notarized and stamped in Thailand. So I paid to have that done before it was sent over to me. But when I took it down to the Chinese consulate, they told me this wasn't their jurisdiction. So they said, well, we only certify documents from Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. You've got to send that back to Thailand if you want to get that certified. So if I wanted to get that particular document certified because I had it notarized in Thailand, would have to send it back in Thailand. But I was sitting there thinking one day, as I was looking at her original certificate she got, because they sent me a copy, notarized copy, and I went, you know what? There's nothing on here that says this is printed in Thailand. I wonder if I can just go get it notarized here in the United States. And I did. It got notarized here, and then I ended up getting the Great Seal over in Lansing, and then it got certified by the Chinese consulate. So it was all just a big hoopla, and a whole bunch of people getting money for signatures, and nobody really authenticating to see if that document is real in the first place. Anyway, so that was my most recent fun with government. I mean, all one has to do is mention the DMV if you want to get somebody going on bureaucracies. Or I'm sure all of you can go on about lots and lots of different examples of bureaucracies from government. There is so much waste, it is not even funny. So the two characteristics of the market economy: quantity, quality, and variety of goods and services tend to increase over time. And that comes straight from the competitive process. It comes straight from all of those entrepreneurs just trying to make a profit. And all of those quantity and quality and variety of goods increases we get is increasing the standard of living of that nation that they are in for all of us in the economy. And with our world economy, it's actually increasing the standard of living for other people in other countries because of trade as well. It's a pretty amazing thing when you sit back and think about it. And then, of course, waste is minimizes and resources tend to be used more efficiently in a market economy. When government decides that they're going to do something, they usually go out and they come up with some arbitrary number that they want to spend on it, and it don't matter what the level of inflation is in the economy, how much expenses increase, decrease, whatever. They're just going to go out there and do that project. And you darn well know there's going to be a lot of waste for it because there is literally no incentive for them to go and you make sure they use that money most efficiently, most effectively. As they say, we don't have nearly as much incentive to spend other people's money as well as we do to spend our own well. We spend our own money much better than we would spend others' people as far as effective and efficiency goes. So chapter 4 is the longer of the next two chapters, so we're going to go right into the others and see if we can get those done as well. So demand schedule is a graphical representation of quantities demanded at specific prices for a specific product. At the micro level, we look at a specific product, while you were in the macro level before when you were looking at a larger area. So you may have been looking at the demand for all of Michigan, or all of the United States, or all of the world. The law of demand is the same at the macro level as it is at the micro level. And comparing potential quantity demanded with price can show us potential revenues. If a company raised its prices, why would quantity demanded decrease? Well, there's a whole bunch of different reasons. You have budget constraints. Individuals only have so much income per year, and when you increase the prices, you're increasing the opportunity costs that they are faced with that particular product. There's also substitutes, so the substitution effect that we see a little bit lower here. Consumers may seek out a substitute for your product. So if Pepsi increases their prices, there's a lot of people that just go right over to Coke, for instance. Then we have this huge key thing called the principle of diminishing marginal utility. Given people only have so much income, individuals must rank what they want the most. Their most important wants are satisfied first, followed by second, third, etc. Now, diminishing marginal utility also helps explain what's called the diamond paradox. The diamond paradox used to puzzle economists for years and years and years and years, and not just economists, philosophers, individuals throughout the world, confused by the fact why diamonds were worth more than water when water is needed to survive, and diamonds are not. Obviously, we have demand and supply, but they weren't really understanding those quite all that well yet, and it really didn't explain that well why something needed for survival wasn't always valued more. Well, the example that ended up explaining it, so the economists that came up with this theory explained it this way. They gave the example of a person that lives in a house on a hill with a well at the bottom of the hill. So when you go down in a day and you get one bucket of water and you bring it up, and that's the one bucket you're going to have for the day, odds are you're just going to use it for drinking. You're not going to use it to clean or do anything with it. But if that day you had more time and you're able to go down and get a second bucket, that second bucket you may be willing to cook with. You may be willing to do a little bit of washing of dishes with it. And when you get the fourth and the fifth and the sixth buckets, all of a sudden you may be willing to bathe in it or use it to just throw on the ground to clean it or water a garden or something along those lines. So as you get more and more and more of something, you value it a bit less and a bit less and a bit less. So this is where we see the diminishing marginal utility part. So the value is diminishing as we get more and more and more access to it. So this is why diamonds are valued more than water, even though water is needed for survival. But it's interesting because you can switch the whole example around and reverse the process, and it still explains it well for us. So if we were in a desert and you were very, very thirsty, you're reaching a point where you weren't sure if you were going to survive without water, and somebody comes up to you and offers you a large bottle of water or a handful of diamonds. Now all of a sudden, because you don't have that large supply of water anymore, you can't just go down to that well and get another bucket of water. That water is worth more than diamonds because you need that water to survive. But as long as we are not in that situation, the reverse is going to be true, where you are going to take those diamonds by far, because you know you can go and sell those diamonds, and you can buy lots and lots and lots and lots of water with that if you really wanted to. So anyway, back to why increased prices will decrease quantity demand. And the other one is the law of competition. So as you increase your prices, competitors may take advantage of that price increase, cut theirs, or advertise the fact that you're a higher price and come in and steal your market share. So why would customers continue to buy even though there is a price increase? So there are situations where if you increase your price, and this is where we start talking about the elasticity of demand. So how sensitive are your customers to price changes? Uh, no matter what, uh, you do a large enough price increase, you are going to cause a drop in quantity demand. That is just an absolute. That's why it's called the law of demand. But there are different levels of that quantity drop that come about. For instance, Apple products. If Apple increases their prices, they generally don't see as much of a price rise. So their consumers are less sensitive to price changes in their products because, well, they have such that heavy following of people that just absolutely love their products. So anyway, so what are a few of those reasons other than so you have personal preference is the second bullet there. That's the example of Apple, but of course there's also the example of maybe your income just may be high enough to where the price increase doesn't affect you. So if you are a luxury good producer, you may be in a situation where if you increase the price a bit, your consumers aren't going to care because they all have that higher income level. So they're not going to be very sensitive to price changes. So a little bit of review because we've already talked about the law of demand. The big thing to remember is that all else equal or Pareto is that we are going to assume that people's incomes, tastes, and other factors and all that are staying the same when we talk about the law of demand. And if any of those things change, then you're going to actually cause a shift to the demand curve versus actually just moving up and down the demand curve as the law of demand would say. So elasticity, we just got a little bit. So it's the impact of price changes have on the company's output and total revenue. So how sensitive individuals are, and you can look at the elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. I'm hoping near the end of the semester when we do the cost analysis section that we will have time to actually go through the math of elasticity. But for now, it's just important to understand that what it is. So if demand is elastic, a decline in price does not just increase the output of a good, but it also increases total revenue. If demand is elastic, quantity demand is sensitive to a price change. So if you decrease your price, you're going to see a significant increase in people buying your product. So it could actually lead to total revenue increases. You're going to be doing better from the price decrease. While if you increase your prices, when we talked about different things that can lead to better profits, I warned you about this situation where the price increase isn't going to overcome the loss that you're going to face from the decrease in revenue from people buying less of your goods and services. So if elasticity of demand is what's called unitary, a decline or an increase in price has no change in the total revenue. So no matter what you do with the price, it's not going to change your revenue whatsoever. And there are very few. There's not really any great examples at all, really, of this situation. If you look at it on a larger scale, anyway. So obviously, if you looked at, so if you were looking at $20,000 cars and you were only looking at a price decrease or increase of $10, odds are you're not going to see increase or decrease in sales of that particular product. You may end up seeing a unitary situation because the price change was small enough. Now, if demand is perfectly inelastic, a decline in prices has no effect on quantity purchased, and the quantity sold increases significantly when the price is lowered. So, when we talk about inelastic demand, we say that demand is insensitive. So, people are insensitive to your price increases. So, you can get away with more price increases. So, like a product like cigarettes can increase their prices more, and they're not going to see any significant change in purchasing of that particular product because of the price increase. Now, when we say it's perfectly inelastic, then we start looking at just basically a straight line. So there's no effect. Well, you already read that to you. But with inelastic, I mean perfectly inelastic and perfectly elastic. So both of those situations, you have a situation that really doesn't happen. So when you read the chapters and whatnot, it's going to show you the charts and stuff for that. Those, just keep in mind that those situations actually do not exist because there's going to be some sort of sensitivity no matter what we do. So we're never going to be perfectly sensitive to everything where one penny is going to cause, well, one penny increase is going to cause a product to be not sold at all. And that's literally, so if customers are perfectly sensitive, so that's a better way to look at it. So if they're perfectly sensitive, we're saying that if you increase the price one penny, people will buy nothing of your product. It's done. And then the opposite, of course, so they're perfectly insensitive. It says that if you raise the price by millions of dollars, the amount being bought or sold won't change as well. So that's why these examples are actually pretty much impossible, because you're going to hit a point where people are going to change their buying habits no matter what the product is. So the equation for elasticity, percentage change is quantity demanded. Well, percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. Hopefully we'll be able to go over the midpoint method for figuring elasticity later on in the semester. Elasticity of demand helps companies decide how raising or lowering prices affects your total revenues. Because if you understand the sensitivity of your customers to prices, you'll be able to understand how much you can increase or decrease prices to get the kind of revenue changes that you are looking for. So on page 117, figure 5.7, it actually gives examples of inelastic, elastic, and even some products that could be argued unitary to a point. And that's the key to remember, that they're only unitary to a point, eventually going to hit those different levels of sensitivity. So on to chapter 6. The market economy is a private enterprise system where decisions are made by individuals who set prices and determine production of goods and services according to supply and demand. So we as individuals throughout the economy all make the decisions on what's going to be produced, what's going to be bought and sold, where things are going, how much, how it's going to be done. All of the decisions on what to do with the factors of production are done by individuals that are seeking profit, that are seeking to better their situation and the situation of their families. If demand increases for a product, will the company raise its prices in response? Not all the time. So you may have large inventories, for instance, and if you have a huge inventory for a particular product, you may want to clear out said inventory. So you may not raise your price at all in response. Or maybe you don't notice the huge demand increase for a particular product. This happens often with fads. So fads are those products that become popular overnight and sell out all the stores. We see a toy usually almost every Christmas that does this. A couple of years ago, it was these things called Hatchimals. You couldn't touch those things in the stores, but the stores didn't catch on to this huge demand increase fast enough, so the shelves all cleared right out. There were huge shortages in it, and they didn't raise the prices at all to compensate for it because, well, they knew as soon as Christmas hit, no one was going to want it anymore because you'd be past, the fad would already be over with, etc. And those things actually stacked up on the shelves literally in January. And but if you wanted one before Christmas, you were going to pay a hefty price on one of the auction sites like eBay to try to get a hold of it. So the market ends up answering, and the price does raise, but the original retailers that sold it missed the opportunity. Now, producing more may increase costs, so higher costs, thus lowering profits due to things like paying overtime. And then, of course, we have concerns over competition. So these are some reasons why we may not end up increasing our prices. Concerns over competition. So if you increase your price, you may be looking at a situation where your competition comes in and excuse me, lowers their price or advertises that you're a higher price and takes your customer because of it. Sorry about the whipping around. I accidentally hit the mouse wheel instead of clicking. Anyway, so supply schedule is a graphical representation of quantities supplied at specific prices for a specific product. And just like when we were talking about demand, when we look at supply at the micro level, we're looking at it for just a specific product instead of the supply of the entire market or all of Michigan or all the world, etc. And the law of the supply is the same at the micro level as it is at the macro level. And the law of supply states that the higher the price of a product, the more a company will produce. And the lower the price means companies are willing to produce less. Because once you get on the supply side, you're looking at the producer's side of things, and the producers are only going to want to produce more if they can make more money, make more profit. So those are your incentives for doing so. So a quick review of equilibrium and market clearing. That's where demand intersects with supply. On page 131, you can actually look at an example, and it will show you equilibrium, your demand and supply curves again, and it actually shows that if, say, your price goes to price A, so your price is above market clearing, you're going to end up seeing a surplus in the marketplace because with the higher price, there's a lower quantity to demand it, but suppliers are willing to supply significantly more quantity. So that's why you end up with a surplus. But if you're at price B, you're in a shortage because the quantity being demanded is significantly higher than the quantity being supplied at the lower price. And of course, market clearing is the best case scenario where we end up basically matching each other perfectly. Everything we produce is sold. So, three essential principles of the market system. The principle of non-discrimination. The marketplace tends to pay the same price no matter what their background is. So when we look at the market as a whole, the market really doesn't care where or what you come from. It's trying to make a profit. It's trying to fulfill the needs. And if you as a company decide to try to discriminate based on color or sexual preference, religion, etc., it comes at a cost, a major cost. And you can look at it's actually, normally this would be a really good example, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. We had the example of the baker that would not sell to the gay couple. And the initial one, the courts, of course, side it with the gay couple, and they end up fining the bakery. But the key to look at in this example isn't what the legal aspect ended up being. If you want to see what the market response was, see what happened to that baker. The baker went out of business. And they didn't go out of business because they got fined, because the fine wasn't that big. They went out of business because they discriminated against part of the marketplace, and a whole bunch of the individuals out there saw that and went, you know what? That's not cool. I'm going to go to a different company. And that's the kind of things that you see in the marketplace. So if you decide to discriminate for one reason or another, not only are you going to lose sales from that entire group, when it gets out that you are doing it, there are other groups within the marketplace that can stop purchasing from you as well. So the market as an incentive system, encouraging individuals to work hard, save, and become more educated. You are in college right now because you have been incentivized by this system, because you believe that by getting this training, getting these degrees, will allow you to do better in life in one way or another, whether it be better in a job, or maybe it's because you really enjoy learning and growing as a person. The more productive you are, the more the market will reward you. So the more efficient and effective that you become at providing those services and products to that marketplace, the more that market system is going to reward you. And that is why even those individuals that are doing really well can actually still be incentivized to further and continue to do really well and continue to provide for those the marketplace. And we want those individuals to. If they're good at it, they are making things better for all of us. And we want them to continue to do so. So we end up with these millionaires and even billionaires now that can arise from the marketplace, and it's literally just coming from that reward system of increasing the standard of living for so many people in the economy and providing so many things that we want or need. So if you can do it yourself and provide that much for so many people, the system should reward you for that kind of a thing. Now, I say the market, though. The market is what's supposed to reward you. If the government is coming in and deciding who gets what reward for what, that completely changes the system up. And then you have people voting, and you have the corruption and all these different things deciding who ends up getting that. And then you have wealth being transferred from one group of people to other people based on decisions by government, not by how much you are benefiting all the individuals in society. So the benefit principle. The principle of accountability says that those who benefit from a product or service should pay for it. So in a market system, you are expected to pay for what you get. So if you are going to benefit for something, you need to pay for it. If you're going to benefit from a house, you're going to buy the house. You're going to benefit from the food, you're going to buy the food. You're going to benefit from the job, you got to work for the job. Provide your labor so that they can buy it. And the company is going to have to pay for your labor because they're going to be the ones that benefit from your labor, etc. And we can go on with tons of examples from that. But that is key. There's got to be that connection between the benefit and individuals. And if you start muddling that up, you change the culture of a country rather quickly, and you start going from a culture that's willing to work hard for what they get to one that is expecting things to be provided for them. Now, keep in mind when we're doing supply and demand analysis, it is limited. It only shows us one product at a time when we're talking about in micro, or maybe we're looking at an aggregate. If you're in gross domestic product, it doesn't change. You're looking at a huge market picture at one time. And it doesn't show us why a company is producing less or more of a product. So if the economy starts producing more as a whole, or if a company starts producing a bunch of products more, it doesn't actually show us why that is happening. We can see it happening, and we're looking at it afterwards, by the way, because this is a snapshot. It's kind of like the balance sheet and the income statement. We can look at a situation of right now or something in the past. It's not going to show us the future. So how does the market respond to shortages and surpluses? So going back to figure 6.10 on page 131, when we were looking at those different situations of inventory surpluses and shortages, so we talked about that depending on where the price is compared to market clearing, we can end up with natural surpluses and natural shortages. Now, the government, of course, is notorious for creating shortages and surpluses. They do that with price controls because they are going to artificially put the price above or below equilibrium. In rent controls, for instance, we artificially put the price above equilibrium. We end up causing housing shortages. Uh, so if you increase the price artificially like that, you can cause the shortages. Anyway, so how does the market respond when we don't have those price controls? Obviously, if you have those price controls in, the market's response is what we call the black market. So we end up selling and buying things under the table where the government can't see it's happening. They do it illegally. But in the marketplace, we just respond to the situation. So if you have a surplus and you are a retailer, so you have a whole bunch of extra inventory, what do? You put it on sale. You put it on clearance. You do something to get rid of it. So you lower the price. And by lowering the price, you get back to that market clearing price and you end up clearing out your inventory. Now, shortages, the price will actually have to come up. And that's the market's actual natural response. So when the price increases, the quantity demand will decrease, and only those willing to give up more for that particular product will be the ones that get the product. So the market actually goes out and naturally rations what's left of that product in the shortage situation. Now, a couple of, oh gosh, it's a year or two ago now, we had that big hurricane down in Florida that caused a bit of a water shortage in the area. And it hit the news about how a 12 pack or a 15 pack of bottled water got all the way up to $20. And people were outraged by it. In the short run, the market responded to this crazy demand of tons of people that were trying to buy water, even if they didn't need it, and the price went up. And that's what actually needed to happen, because then the people that really needed the water were the ones that were paying for it. But at the same time, it sent a huge signal out to the marketplace. This is the key. It told the market, the rest of the United States, that there was a water shortage, and the market responded very quickly. Companies like Budweiser, for instance, actually switched their production completely over to water and got water down there. And literally, within 24 hours, the price was already dropping, and within, I believe it was 3 days, the price of water for a pack was below what it was before the hurricane. So the role of the price system. Prices ration scarce resources. So as resources become more scarce and fewer, the price is going to go up, and only those with the most productive and efficient means, because they are the ones that can turn around and still make a profit at those higher prices, are going to be the ones that pay the price. Prices influence human behavior. So when the price of that water started going up, all of a sudden people were starting to be a heck of a lot more careful with the bottled water that they had. And they were rationing it out and pushing it out to make sure that that water would last until the market or somebody would respond to the shortage situation that was in the area. Now, on page 140 to 142, we can get into a review on consumer and producer surplus. It's going to show you it on the charts and whatnot. Hopefully in macro you did learn how to figure consumer and producer surplus for the market. I'm going to just do a really quick review of it. So consumer surplus is this. If you're looking for consumer surplus for just one consumer, you take the maximum price that you are willing to pay for something. So let's say we were looking at a Morgan silver dollar, and the maximum price you were willing to pay for it was $40. And the price in the market for that silver dollar is $30. And you pay that $30. The difference between the maximum price that you're willing to pay and what the price ends up being is consumer surplus. So in this case, 40 minus 30 equals 10. $10 is your consumer surplus. Now the producer surplus. So the producer that ends up getting it. So maybe the producer the producer bought the Morgan silver dollars from somebody else and is turning around and selling it. So they're more of a supplier in this case than actually producing the silver dollar, because this is something that's already in the marketplace. So the price ends up being $30 still, but the producer's minimum willingness to sell is what we're looking at, because they're the ones trying to get the highest price possible. But the minimum they were willing to take is $20, say. So if the price in the marketplace is 30, they're really happy because it's above that minimum. So 30 minus 20 equals 10. You have a $10 consumer surplus. Now, if you wanted to look at consumer and producer surplus for the entire marketplace, then we'd take the consumer surplus of 10 and the producer surplus of 10, and we add those together. If there was only one consumer and producer, anyway. Now, to figure it for the entire marketplace, you'd actually have to look at the producer and consumer surplus for everyone in that marketplace, and you do so by figuring out the areas of the triangle. So if you look at figure 6.15 for consumer surplus, for instance, it shows the triangle PAE. It's that highlighted area there. So if you were going to figure out the consumer surplus for the entire market, you'd have to figure out the area of that triangle using the numbers given to you on the chart. And of course, your area for a triangle is base times height divided by 2. And then you'd have the consumer surplus. And then of course, producers, you'd be looking at the triangle beneath. So in this case, figure 6.16, and they're calling it seller's rent in our particular textbook here. But it's the same thing, producer surplus. You'd be finding the area for that triangle. And anything, so when you draw your price line in, anything above the price line, the triangle that's left above the price line is your producer. Not your producer. Anything above the price line is consumer surplus. Anything below the price line is producer surplus. And when you're at equilibrium, there is no deadweight loss. But as soon as you get outside of equilibrium, so that case where the price is above or below equilibrium, you have what's called deadweight loss. And that's surplus that goes to no one. It's surplus that is lost. It's potential that we could have had, but nobody ends up getting it. And deadweight loss is caused by your price controls, most commonly in an economy, at least larger levels of deadweight loss. And that's it for chapters 4, 5, and 6. Thanks for listening.